A classical philosophical problem is the problem of other minds. It's a problem in epistemology. Epistemology is that branch of philosophy that is concerned with knowledge. Do we have it? What are its limits? What is its structure? And the problem of other minds is a problem in epistemology. It asks, do we know there are other minds besides our own? And if we do, how do we know it? What is our basis, our evidence, our grounds, our justification for believing that other creatures have thoughts and experiences and feelings as we have them? Now, I've always thought this was a very practical problem. It's been one of my favorite philosophical problems because it has a very practical day-to-day side to it. We all confront this problem in one way or another in our daily lives. If not in the general form that philosophers address it, then in its very specific form. We've each probably wondered at some time or another about another human being, a loved one, a child, a parent, whether they really loved us. What did they really feel about us? Asking them, we can do that, but we never can be quite sure that they're telling the truth. And that is a kind of application of the problem of other minds. How does another human being really feel about me? We confront the same kind of problem in a poker game when we're wondering whether that big bet from the guy across the table is a bluff or whether he really has what he pretends he has in his hand. What we're asking is, what's going on in his mind? I can read the signs, but are the signs reliable? I have this problem come up again and again in my own house. My wife loves asparagus. I dislike asparagus, and I find myself wondering again and again whether asparagus can taste the way to her that it tastes to me. I can't believe it does, otherwise she wouldn't like it. And when I ask her, she says it tastes wonderful. Well, she thinks chocolate ice cream tastes wonderful too, so that doesn't tell me just how it tastes to her. And I, frankly, don't know how to find out whether it tastes the same to her as it does to me. That's a problem, a practical application of the problem of other minds. Now, philosophers tend to address this problem in a much more generalized form. They don't ask about how this tastes to that person or whether that person likes me as they pretend to and so on. They're asking the much more generalized version of this question: what are grounds for supposing that any other living being or non-living object, for that matter, has thoughts, feelings, and experiences? That's a very generalized version of the problem, and one of the ways that that problem has been answered in the history of philosophy is by the claim that our justification for believing that other people have thoughts and experiences as we do is by analogical reasoning. Analogical reasoning is this kind of reasoning. You're wondering whether some object X has a certain property. You can't observe it to have that property, so you're trying to find whatever evidence you can find about the probability that it has that property. So you reason as follows: well, X is very similar in many ways to this object or these objects that I know have the property. These objects are analogous in many respects. And the more analogous they are, the more probable it is that this object I'm not sure about has the property that these similar objects have. So, for instance, I go to buy a bottle of wine. I don't know how good the wine is, so I look at the label. I say, well, it's this kind of grape. It was made by this chateau in France, bottled there, made there. It has this kind of grape. So I'm saying it's similar in many respects to wines I've had in the past, and those wines were good. Therefore, I infer that by analogy, this wine will also be good. Now, this is probable reasoning. There's no certainty to the conclusion, but one supposes that the more respects in which the unknown object resembles the known objects, then the higher probability there is that it will also possess the property that we're concluding it has. Or if you're investing in the stock market, you're looking at a stock, you're wondering whether to buy it. You look at features it has, what's the management of the company, what's its price-earnings ratio. You're comparing it to other stocks, which you perhaps know have been good investments, in order to reason by analogy that this too will probably be a good investment if it's similar enough to others that you know to be good. I'm recently taking a tree identification course, trying to identify trees. Often my reasoning is analogical. What's this tree? Is it an oak tree? Well, its leaves have this shape, the leaf buds look like this, it has these kind of twigs and so on. So, since oak trees have those features, it's probably an oak tree. One of the most famous or infamous, depending on your point of view, uses of the analogical reasoning was William Paley's argument for the existence of a creator of the universe. Paley argued that the universe is similar in many respects to an elaborate contrivance, like a clock or a watch. Its parts are elaborately designed and fit together so as to promote some end and so on. And when he compared this to the human eye or the human body or the universe as a whole, he thought the analogy was so striking that one could conclude by analogy that since the watch or the clock had a maker, so too did the universe. Now, if you use analogical reasoning, it seems that one could conclude that since I know I have thoughts and experiences, feelings, since you are very similar to me, and I could just tick off the points of similarity, both in appearance, behavior, origin, background, so on, the resemblance is so striking that by analogy one infers that you too possess the property which, though I can't observe that you have it, the probability that you have it is overwhelmingly great given that you are so similar to me in every outward respect. Language, of course, speech being one of the most salient respects in which we resemble each other. Now, the strength of analogical reasoning is proportional to the degree of resemblance. The greater the resemblance, the greater the positive analogy, the stronger is the reasoning. So that the more traits you find in common, then the higher the probability is that the object whose you're questioning whether it has the property, the greater the probability is that it shares the unknown property, the target property. But there are no things resemble each other in every respect. There's always a negative analogy. There are features that the two things don't share in common. So I look at the wine and I say, well, it's from the same chateau, it's red, same grape, bottled in the same year, so it'd probably be good. But wait a minute, this bottle's been sitting in the sunlight for several days, The other bottles weren't. Now that's a point of disanalogy and weakens the conclusion because, of course, one supposes that sitting in the sunlight doesn't do the wine much good. Anytime you're reasoning in an analogical way like this, you have to compare the points of similarity with the points of dissimilarity and, as it were, add them up. Not only does one have to take into account the points of dissimilarity, but one has to ask oneself, how relevant are these points of similarity? I mean, just because the wine comes in a bottle of the same shape, that's a point of similarity, I suppose, but one asks oneself, is that relevant? What does that have to do with the quality of the wine? Just because it's bottled in a bottle of the same shape. So it's important when arguing or reasoning analogically that one look at the relevance of the characteristics which the things share. The more relevant those things are to the target property, the stronger the reasoning is. Well, that's by way of introduction to my topic this evening, animal minds. Because philosophers, and I assume a great many other people, have supposed that our grounds, our justification for believing that animals had thoughts, feelings, experiences, much the same as ours, or if not much the same as ours, something like ours, was based on the analogy between them and us. The more they resembled us in appearance, the more they resembled us in behavior, the more they resembled us in composition and anatomy, then the greater the probability that they too had the properties that we know we have, namely experiences. We feel hunger, we feel pain, we feel joy, we feel curiosity, and we're willing to attribute those attributes, those mental attributes, to animals, so it seems plausible to say, in virtue of the analogy that they bear to us, so that we ask ourselves, well, chimpanzees resemble us in some respects, certainly in a lot more respects than turtles do. And so one supposes that the argument that chimpanzees think, feel joy, hunger, pain, so on, the conclusion is much stronger in the case of a chimpanzee than it is in the case of a turtle, and even stronger than for something that resembles us even less, perhaps a goldfish. As you go down the phylogenetic scale, the resemblances become less and less, and hence our feelings that these creatures really do possess a mind of any significant sort at all becomes less and less. That's because the analogical reasoning depends on fewer and fewer traits in which we share with these creatures. So at the top, you could suppose there are you and me. We know we've got a mind. At the bottom, there's something like a rock. We don't think it has a mind. But we resemble rocks hardly at all. And in between, we have chimpanzees, monkeys, dogs, cats, fish, and so on. We also have plants. Plants, we suppose, resemble us even less than most animals. And so we're unwilling, perhaps, at least many of us, to suppose that plants have any feelings at all. Although I know some people think there's a sufficient similarity there to justify the attribution of some kind of mental trait. Now, there are some people, they're called panpsychists, that is, who think that everything is minded, even the rocks. But I'm not going to worry about those tonight. I'm going to suppose that you agree with me that the rocks don't have mental attributes, are not minded, but that it's plausible to suppose that many animals are. And the more the animals resemble us, the more plausible it is to suppose that they resemble us in this target property of mentality. Now, what I'm going to do, I want to look at this reasoning, and I want to look at some of the features that all of us use when we think about this question. The appearance of animals, the behavior of animals, the history of animals, that is, what kind of developmental or evolutionary history they've had, the composition of animals, and ask, look, I know we use these features in making inferences about what's going on inside of them, whether they have a mind, and if so, what's going on in that mind. So I think we all do use these features in making inferences about animals. I want to look at them and try to evaluate the justification for using those features. Because I'm convinced that some of the things we use are not legitimately used at all. And other things that we don't use at all or don't think much about using have greater validity than the things we actually use. You can ask yourself when I'm through whether you agree with me about these conclusions, but I want to walk us through them and tell you why I think these things. All right, so I'm going to start with, I'm going to list 4 features, and first I'm going to make the case that we do indeed rely on these things, and then I want to ask, should we rely on them? Is there any basis for thinking that these features are symptomatic or indicative of mindedness on the part of the creatures who exhibit these features? Before I start this, though, let me point out 2, as it were, features of this analogical reasoning. Some properties, some features are not directly relevant, but you may know special things that make them relevant. For instance, where you buy the wine, what store you buy the wine, may not be relevant to the quality of the wine, but you may know something in particular. You may know that a certain store is managed or owned by a wine expert who only stocks very special quality wines. And then to point out that the wine is being bought at this store makes the fact that it's being sold at that store especially relevant to your inferences about the quality of the wine. The place you buy a wine isn't, generally speaking, relevant to the quality of the wine, but sometimes it can be relevant if the place has some special features. And we have to remember that when we're thinking about animals and trying to make inferences, because it may be that perhaps their appearance isn't itself a relevant feature, but it may indicate something else that is relevant. And I'll come back to that fact several times in talking about our analogical reasoning concerning animal minds. The second feature I want to mention is that because a certain property or attribute is part of the positive analogy, you say, look, we share this with the animals, and we think, therefore the animal probably thinks. That's part of the positive analogy. Now, just because something is part of the positive analogy doesn't mean that its absence argues against the presence of thought. That is, I might look at the label and say, oh, this is a very famous chateau on the wine bottle. That indicates that it's probably a very good wine. Now, just because that argues positively for the quality of the wine doesn't mean that its absence is an argument that the wine isn't a quality wine. There are many good wines. Just because some feature argues for the presence of quality doesn't mean its absence is an argument against quality. For instance, if I found an animal that before it went to sleep put pajamas on, and every morning when it got up, it dressed for the day, this would be a remarkable piece of behavior which I would take to indicate, be a positive reason to suppose that animal had thoughts and feelings like me. But its absence in an animal isn't an argument that the animal doesn't have thoughts and feelings like me. So we got to remember this. Sometimes I think people want to say that because a certain thing, which were it present, would indicate that the animal had thoughts and feelings, because it's not present, argues that the animal doesn't have thoughts and feelings. That's a fallacy. All right, the first feature I want to talk about is just the simple appearance of an animal. How much it looks like us. And I think most people are inclined to think that this is a significant and a relevant fact in making inferences about whether these animals are like us with respect to inner affairs. Chimps look more like us than do turtles. Therefore, it's more reasonable to suppose that chimpanzees have a mind something like ours than it is to suppose that turtles do. Now, of course, the absence of resemblance here isn't an argument that they don't. That would be the fallacy. There may be extraterrestrials. We all know enough science fiction to know that extraterrestrials may look like rocks, but still have a complete mental life. No, the absence of this doesn't argue against a mind, but you think the presence of a similarity in appearance does argue for the presence of a mind. At least I think many of us, I know myself, before I started thinking about this topic in any sustained way, would have said that yes, the appearance is a tip-off, it's a clue, an indication, a sign that anything that bears that close analogy to me, then the closer the analogy is, the better the reasoning, probably shares with me certain mental attributes too. Now, I think that's simply wrong. Appearance has absolutely nothing to do with the mental characteristics of the animal in question. After all, dead people resemble us more than chimpanzees do. They don't have any mental life. And if appearance was an argument for the mental life of the resembling organism, then you would think dead people. We had a better reason for supposing that dead people were thinking and feeling than chimpanzees. But this seems wrong. We don't, in fact, suppose that the mere resemblance in appearance between us and something else is a reason to think that that other object has a mental life. And we know people asleep or in a coma There's nothing going on in there, or there need not be anything going on in there. And yet, these people resemble us as closely as it's possible to resemble us. And yet, we know, or at least we believe, that nothing need be going on there. Of course, something might be. Even in sleep, we have dreams, but I'm talking about dreamless sleep and a coma or anesthetic in which no sensations, no feelings, no thoughts occur at all. So I think appearance, though we in fact tend to rely on that sometimes, is in fact not an indicator at all and should be ignored in evaluating the likelihood that an animal thinks or feels the way we do. The second feature I want to talk about, besides appearance, is the composition, what the animal is actually made out of. And here I want to talk about composition because I think a lot of people think about this when they think about whether computers have thoughts and feelings. And the feeling is, look, I think I share this with many of you, that somehow computers don't do it because they're just not made out of the right stuff. You know, it's not wetware, it's hardware there. They don't bleed. Now, and they don't have a kind of anatomy like us. They're not wired like we are. And even if they are put together in very complex ways, the actual composition isn't the right stuff. It's silicon, not carbon. And somehow, carbon's the right stuff to be made out of if you're going to be a thinker of thoughts and a feeler of feelings. Now, I think of this as kind of the organic prejudice, that you got to be made out of the right stuff if you're going to be a thinker or an experiencer. If you're not made out of the right stuff, there's no hope for you. Now, I know, of course, that some people won't agree with this. I know that people in AI, artificial intelligence, many computer scientists don't share this carbon prejudice. They think, in fact, that the systems they design and program do, in fact, think. Now, maybe they don't have feelings, maybe they don't feel pain or pleasure, but they think, they plan, they make decisions, they reason, they do calculations, they play chess. In fact, they play chess better than we do. And we all know they do now. And they do the calculations we can't do. They're doing more of the computations that we can't do. And this leads many people to suppose that there's absolutely no reason to deny mentality to such machines. Your refusal to do so, or the refusal of some people to do so, and I include myself in that because I have the carbon prejudice, the prejudice toward organic material. And I call this a prejudice because I think there's no basis for it. I see absolutely no reason for supposing that you have to be made out of a certain material in order to enjoy thought. Maybe there is a reason. Maybe we will someday learn that unless you're made out of carbon molecules, unless you're kind of organic in some way, you just can't have a thought. You can't have a feeling. If it's silicon, sorry. Silicon won't do it. But I don't see any reason now in looking at the periodic table that there's anything special about carbon and mentality which restricts mentality to carbon-based creatures. Maybe someday we'll discover something which does restrict it that way. But today I don't think there's any basis for what I'm calling the carbon or the organic prejudice. Now, that prejudice takes, you can ask yourself whether you share with me that prejudice. It finds expression in a lot of ways. You could ask yourself, would you want your daughter marrying a machine? And you say, well, what if this machine just was a witty sort of thing, and you love spending time with it, you go to the movies with it, got a PhD from MIT, and you say, well, wait a minute, this is a machine. Yeah, it's not made out of organic matter, but so what? Why shouldn't she marry it, supposing marriage was possible between humans and machines? Well, somebody might say, well, they couldn't have children. No, but they could adopt some. So your desire for grandchildren, you can have grandchildren. I think many people would be distressed at the thought that there might be this kind of relationship between their children or themselves. You think of making love to a machine. And the question is, I think many people feel that, look, a machine, however it behaved, just the idea that, when it broke its arm, you took it to an electronics parts store instead of a doctor, just killed the enthusiasm for the whole affair. And that's an expression, as I see it, of this carbon prejudice. Now, the reason I'm calling it a prejudice is simply because I don't see what the justification is for supposing that the kind of mental life we enjoy couldn't be enjoyed by a system that was based on some other material, silicon. I have never heard an argument that said that if you weren't made out of carbon, you can't have feelings. And until I hear that argument, I will have to suppose that the composition of things is pretty much irrelevant to their enjoyment of a mental life. And hence I'll continue to call this bias against machines, I'll call it a prejudice until we have a reason to suppose that it's something other than a prejudice. It's something like, people have a prejudice against wines from a certain part. You say, look, California wines, they're just not as good as French wines. This is a prejudice that many people had for a long time until certain blind taste tests and so on convinced them that, in fact, they couldn't tell the difference. In fact, some of the California wines were much superior. But this was kind of a locational prejudice. Certain places just have better wines. And the idea was, well, why couldn't good wines be made here? Well, now that's what I call a prejudice, and it's something like the prejudice against silicon chips. So I'm taking the first two features, the appearance and the composition of something, and I'm saying we all do tend to use those features as relevant. When we're reasoning analogically, could this thing have a mental life? We do tend to look at its appearance and its composition. And if it doesn't have the right composition, doesn't have the right appearance or right enough, we tend to dismiss it as not a candidate for a mental life. I take that to be a way we do in fact reason, but not a justified way of reasoning, not a way we should reason. It's not legitimate. Which brings me to my third feature, which is probably a feature many of you have been thinking to yourself, well, why doesn't he get to this? Because this is the one we all rely on, and that's the behavior of the system. After all, animals eat, sleep, squeal when you step on their tail. They look at things, they listen, they sniff, they run, they cower, hide. The list could go on almost endlessly of things animals do. Not all animals, of course. If you go down far enough, the resemblances here in behavior become less and less. But we're thinking of household pets, especially dogs and cats, but certainly the higher apes, chimpanzees, monkeys, and so on. And there, it seems like the resemblances, the analogies are so striking in behavior that we are entitled to infer, not of course with certainty, because any inferential reasoning of this sort, any conclusion of an analogical argument, is a conclusion that follows only with some degree of probability. This is not deductive reasoning, it's inductive reasoning. Now, plants also behave. Trees shed their leaves in the autumn, at least the deciduous trees. They change color. Some plants capture insects and consume them. So plants behave too, but you say, look, this is pretty minimal behavior. It's not enough like our behavior to merit the conclusion that these plants have a mental life. Or if we have to grant them some mental life, it's so minuscule that we can not worry much about it. But as soon as you move to the higher animals, then you think the analogies become so striking and overwhelming that the conclusion is absolutely irresistible. Now, one of the most striking pieces of behavior, of course, is speech, our possession of language. We talk. As far as we know, animals don't, at least. I mean, there's a question of animal communication, and that certainly exists at all levels, not at all levels, but at many levels, some kind of communication between animals. But speech and language as we know it, if it exists at all, exists rarely and in a very primitive form in animals. Now, some people, very famous people, René Descartes, a very famous French philosopher, concluded that because animals lacked language, they lacked thought. And because they lacked thought, they lacked a mind, because for Descartes, the mind essentially was constituted by thought-like processes. And so Descartes concluded that the sheep, when it saw the wolf approaching and it ran, did not actually experience the wolf. There was no consciousness in there. This was like a reflex, something like the blink reflex. When someone comes at your eye very quickly, you blink, but you don't blink as where you don't choose to blink. The eye does that on its own. It's a reflex. And Descartes had this view of animals too, that their behavior, which might appear to be intelligent behavior motivated by certain desires and thoughts, was in fact strictly reflexive. And some modern philosophers have concluded similarly, that lacking language, animals could not be credited with thought. One of the best-known philosophers, Donald Davidson, who's a well-known article promoting this view. Now, the fact that animals lack language seems to me part of the disanalogy. So you'd have to say, well, all right, there's a lot of behaviors we share with animals. That's part of the positive analogy. Against the analogy is the fact that they don't talk to each other. They don't talk to us. All right, that's part of the negative, but besides that, the positive is so great that certainly that's not decisive. And besides, infants don't have language either, and we all suppose that they're conscious. A 6-month-old child can't talk. Yet, who of us would suppose that a 6-month-old human infant is not conscious, doesn't feel hunger, thirst, pain? I think that would be an extraordinary conclusion, just because it can't yet speak to us. And if we're willing to credit human infants with the powers of consciousness, the kind of that sort of thing, perhaps not thought, perhaps infants can't yet think or reason, but that doesn't mean they don't have a mind. They don't feel and experience. They don't see, hear, smell, taste. And that's the kind of attribute we're considering in attributing mentality to animals. Do they have experiences like those of a 6-month-old human child? If they do, then to that degree they participate in a mental life. Whether or not they can think or reason in any sophisticated way is another question. Perhaps they can't. Perhaps language is, to some degree, or maybe to a great degree, essential for a lot of the kind of reasoning and thought that we indulge in as adults. So, if that's so, animals that lack a language don't have thoughts, don't reason in that way. But the question is, do they have the other aspects of mentality which we suppose is part of the total package? Do they have the feelings and the experiences and the emotions that we feel are also part of a mental life? Now, I myself don't think language is essential for thought. There are just too many ways of evincing and manifesting thought that are non-linguistic to suppose that language is essential for thought. Everyone who's owned a pet probably has an anecdote or two about a pet dog or cat showing by certain forms of behavior that it had reached a certain conclusion in a certain way, that it had made an inference, that it knew certain things that are quite striking. One of the most famous anecdotes of this sort come from, I think, from the Greeks. There was a dog following something. I don't know whether it was some other animal it was chasing or just following its master home. The dog was sniffing along the trail as he followed the scent. He came to a fork in the road. The dog went down the right fork, kept sniffing, lost the scent. It wasn't there. So he turned around and ran down the other fork without sniffing. Now, if you think about that, what that dog had to be doing is what logicians call the disjunctive syllogism. That is, he either went this way or that way. Sniff's a sniff. He didn't go that way. Must have been that way. The dog had to do that. He didn't sniff on the other trail, so he must have just, concluded. He went that way. Now, that seems like a striking piece of behavior which can only be explained by an implicit form of reasoning. And I've heard similar anecdotes from my friends and colleagues throughout the years about their pets and what they can do. I won't drag them out tonight. I'm sure you have your own. So it's kind of examples like that convince one that although language may be necessary for certain kinds of thought, I can't imagine a creature without language thinking to itself that next week is its birthday it seems to me that thought is a fairly sophisticated thought, and if you didn't have language, it's hard to see how you could think it. But that they can't think certain things like the stick my master threw landed over here, or food's about to be delivered. Those thoughts seem eminently accessible to animals without language. So my conclusion on this third feature, I dismissed appearances, I dismissed composition, but I'm claiming we not only use, but as far as I can see, we have every right to use the analogies of behavior as a basis for concluding that the animals that exhibit that analogous behavior also exhibit, although out of sight, an analogous form of mental life. Now, what's happened in the last 20 or 30 years is our developments in psychology and neuroscience which have challenged that basis for analogical reasoning about the mental life of animals. What happened, I mentioned earlier that one famous form of analogical reasoning was William Paley's reasoning that the world must have had a creator because it was so analogous to artifacts like watches and clocks that we know had a creator. So by analogy, the world must have had a creator. Now, one development that did much to undermine that as an argument was the development of Darwinian evolutionary theory. Because evolutionary theory said, oh, wait a minute, we can account for the design that you appeal to in reasoning analogically to a creator. We can show you that that design can come about without a creator through some process of natural selection. Now, this was not an argument against the existence of a God. It was just an argument that that kind of reasoning wasn't a valid form of reasoning to the existence of God. So it was a challenge to the reasoning, not a challenge to the conclusion. Because if you can show that the analogous properties can come about in some other way, other than the way alleged, then you have undermined that form of inference to the conclusion. And this, it seems to me, has what is happening and has been happening recently in psychology and neuroscience, because what has happened is that the behaviors which we take to be symptomatic and indicative of a mental life, of consciousness, of perceptions, seem to be able to be carried out without the corresponding consciousness. And I'm thinking, I'm sure many of you here know about these developments. One of them is called blind sight, in which patients who have had parts of their brain injured, the visual cortex, are no longer able to see things in certain parts of their visual field. So they're completely blind to things, say, on the right side. Now, at least if you ask them, they say, I can see nothing. If you put objects over there, ask them if they can see them, they'll say, no, I see nothing, it's all black. Yet, it turns out that if you put them in certain circumstances, they can identify the objects over there. If they're forced to guess, they guess correctly, consistently. That is, if you put X's over there rather than O's, they'll guess X's. If you put things at this orientation rather than that orientation, they'll guess the orientation. If you put red things rather than green things, they'll guess red. In fact, recent developments, if you put smiley faces rather than sad faces, they'll say smiley faces. Even though they say they can't see anything, they are nonetheless getting the information through the eyes about what's there and certain aspects of what's there without any experience of the things there. One of the most striking sort of illustrations of this is not with a human being, but with a monkey called Helen, that a psychologist, Nicholas Humphrey, worked with for many years, as many as 10 years. The monkey had its entire visual cortex removed and was entirely blind after the removal of the visual cortex. The monkey just sat, wouldn't even look at anything. But gradually over the years, within a space of 2 or 3 years, started to run around and exhibit perfectly normal behavior. It could avoid obstacles, run through the yard, running around trees and bushes. It would pick up raisins on the ground. It could catch things that you threw to it. It would pick up objects. Now, the psychologist working with Helen said that Helen was blind, was having no conscious visual experiences, and yet was exhibiting perfectly or near perfect normal behavior when asked to negotiate its way through its environment. Now, what we have here is a case of behavior that is terribly analogous to our behavior, the behavior of people who have conscious experience, and this is by an animal who has no conscious experience. Incidentally, they have devised ways of testing animals and asking them whether they're having conscious visual experiences, whether they see anything, so that you can actually test for that too. And these animals can't see anything. Yet, that doesn't prevent them from behaving as though they are seeing something. Now, if you think about that, you see what this does to analogical reasoning about the mental life of animals. Look, if animals can behave that way without seeing anything, without conscious experience, then how do I know they're not always doing that? How do I know they are conscious of the things that they avoid, the things they pick up, the things they catch? Because we know that animals can do it without conscious experience now. What these developments in neuroscience psychology suggest is just what Darwinian evolution did to Paley's argument. They said, look, we now know you can get the same result in some other way. What does that do to the argument that it must be that way? It undermines it. It doesn't show that the animals don't have conscious experiences. What it shows is that you can't reason analogically anymore to the conclusion that they must be having experiences because their behavior is so analogous to ours, people who do have experiences. Now, what I think that the situation that leaves us in is that analogical arguments for the existence of minds in animals has been and is being threatened by these kind of developments. And I want to kind of end my talk by mentioning one other feature which I haven't talked about yet. I won't go on long about this, but I think has a way of kind of reinstituting the analogical reasoning on the kind of basis that I think it properly belongs to it. And this is, the last feature I'm going to mention is the history of these animals. That is, sometimes when we reason about an object, we reason about its appearance, its behavior, its composition, but sometimes we say, oh, yes, it has the same appearance, same composition and so on, but I also think it has had the same kind of history, and that's relevant to whether it's got the target property or not. Let me give you an example of this. If you took a piece of paper that had exactly the appearance of a $20 bill, was composed of exactly what real $20 bills are composed of, and as a result behaved exactly as real $20 bills do, that is, you could buy things with it and get change for it and so on, that wouldn't make it a real $20 bill. Whether it's a real $20 bill or not depends on whether it was printed in an authorized printing office of the authorized government. If it was made in your basement, it's counterfeit. And so a thing has to have the right history to be a genuine $20 bill. If it doesn't have that history, it's not genuine. No matter what its appearance, no matter what its composition, and no matter what its behavior, doesn't have the right history, it's not genuine. Now, maybe then what we ought to think about when we're reasoning about animals is not just their appearance and their composition and their behavior, but whether they've had the right kind of history. I'll give you an example. This is going to be an example about a plant, but I'm trying to make a point about the relevance of history, not at the moment about the existence of thought. There's a certain plant, it's called the scarlet galea, that changes color in July every year. It changes from red to white in the middle of July. That's a piece of plant behavior. It's something the plant does. Now, the way botanists explain why the plant does this, the botanist I read said, well, the scarlet galea does this, it behaves that way, and this is why it does it, because early in the season, hummingbirds are around, and hummingbirds like red flowers. So the flower is red for the hummingbirds. In July, the hummingbirds generally fly away, and certain moths arrive. Moths don't like red flowers, they like white flowers. So now the flower changes white to attract the moths, because for pollination purposes. So that's why the plant changes color, to increase its pollination opportunities and possibilities. All right. Now think about the scarlet galea planted in one part of the garden, and it's changing color in order to attract the moths. Imagine that same plant having a different history, a different evolutionary history. It wasn't pollinated by hummingbirds and moths. Rather, in July every season, beetles arrived who loved red blossoms and ate the plant. So what the plant did, it evolved a strategy to repel the beetles. It changed to white flowers in the middle of July each year in order to repel these beetles. All right, we plant this version of scarlet galea in this part of the garden. Now, these two plants are going to behave in exactly the same way in July every year. They're both going to change from red to white. Why does this plant change color? In order to attract the moths. Why does this plant change color? In order to repel the beetles. Much different explanations of why they're behaving that way, even though their appearance and their constitution and their behavior is exactly the same. There's much different reasons for why they're behaving that way. Take the last example here. In the third part of the garden, what we plant is something that was synthesized in the botanist's laboratory. They put it together out of molecules that they had laying around. It happens to be indistinguishable from the scarlet galea. It's a perfect replica of the plant. They put it there. It too, being physically indistinguishable from the other two, will change color in the middle of July. Why is it changing color? Is it changing color in order to attract the hawk moths? No. Is it changing color in order to repel the beetles? No. There's no reason it's changing color. Has the same composition, it looks exactly the same, and it behaves exactly the same. except it's not doing that for the same reason as the other plants. What that shows is that if you're going to make conclusions about why an organism is behaving the way it is, and that's what we think of when we think of the mind as why an animal is behaving the way it is, you have to look at not only the appearance, the composition, and the behavior itself, but you have to look at how it got to the point of behaving that way, its history, its evolutionary history, and its developmental history. And if that's not the same, then the reasoning, the analogical reasoning by means of which you reach the conclusion that system must have a mind, is to that extent fallacious. Thank you.
Questions? Dr. Clark?
The question was, have I and other people who study animals, I'm not a scientist, but I am interested in and read a lot about animals, has our thinking about the capacity of animals for thought, has that changed over the last few decades? That was the question? Yes, I think it has. There's enormous amount of work in the animal psychology done with all kinds of animals. I was in the UBC psychology department just yesterday talking to someone doing experiments with worms and their capacity to learn and capacity to remember. A lot has been learned about the capacities of animals, both very elementary capacities for learning, but also very sophisticated things about self-recognition and inferences that animals seem able to make about what other people that it see know about things it's interested in finding out about. Extraordinary results which continue to enhance, as it were, our respect for what animals are capable of. But most of this, of course, is assuming that something's going on in the mind of these animals. It's just how fancy is it? And it keeps getting fancier and fancier.
By saying that the brain just resisted them. For instance, hunger. We know that comes about when you have a low blood sugar level, when blood sugar level drops.
Yeah.
How do you explain that?
The question was, some of the things I'm suggesting that in the case of animals, we need to introduce thoughts and experiences and attitudes for hunger, feelings, to explain the behavior of the animal. It's equally well explained by simply physiological processes. Don't neuroscientists, can't they explain these things? Or if they can't explain them today, won't they be able to explain them in 100 years without mentioning thirst, hunger, feeling, fear, anger? So what's this talk of thirst, hunger, fear, and anger doing in the case of understanding the behavior of animals? Well, if they can do it with animals, they can do it with us. That is, I think if neuroscientists can explain the behavior of a thirsty animal without ever mentioning the thirst of the animal, it will be able to explain my behavior without ever mentioning the fact that I'm thirsty. I mean, I too am an animal and am composed of neurons, synaptic connections, hormones, so on. And I do think that eventually we'll hear a story from neuroscientists. It will be this kind of story about what kind of activates the muscles and so on. So if we can do it with animals, we should be eventually able to do it with us too. That won't convince me that I didn't drink it because I was thirsty. It will just mean that neuroscientists have an explanation for the movement of my limbs which led me to pick up the glass. That won't show I didn't drink it was because it's thirsty. It will show that that's a different kind of explanation than the neuroscientific explanation. That isn't a very satisfactory reply to your question, but I've worried about that problem in the book I wrote, Explaining Behavior, when I put it that way. I said, look, if neuroscientists can now or will someday explain why my hand moves the way it does when I reach out to pick up a glass of water, then what's this explanation in psychology that I reached out to pick it up because I was thirsty? It looks like one of those explanations. If you've got it, you don't need the other one. And so I worried about that question and thought I supplied an answer, but I won't try to give that full answer today. It's a good question, and I've just tried to hint at the answer.
Question up there.
I was looking about the I wrote that down, but the expectation of a human being on an animal reaction. I can't tell you how many times I've heard people say, for example, I own 2 cats, and I go away for a couple of days, and people say, oh, don't they get mad at you for leaving them alone, or something like that. I can't understand why people think that because I would react a certain way, then my cats would react the same way. How do you define between how a human being would react and how we expect animals to react on the same level? I hope I answered.
Yeah. Did most people hear that question? Oh. She's worried about, she leaves her cats, and people ask, well, don't your cats get angry? Don't they get mad when you leave them for days? And she's wondering, why do they think that the cats, the animals, will experience these emotions that humans would experience in similar situations? Where's the source of that sort of anthropomorphism on the part of people when they think of animals? I think often there is a large dose of anthropomorphism going on here. People talk about the cat being embarrassed and so on. You want to say, come on, the embarrassment's a pretty fancy emotion, and I don't know whether cats experience it. They probably experience something, but that's not the right description of it. So I would agree that often it's much inflated, at least from my point of view, it's inflated. But it depends. Sometimes it seems dogs do get angry. I think maybe that's an apt word to describe what the dog is feeling, or it's certainly hunger seems to be a right term. I don't think that's anthropomorphic. So we have to look at which words are appropriate and which perhaps are just taking it a bit too far. And if we want to give an accurate description, choose those that are apt and avoid the others.
Right there at the back, in the green jacket.
I don't know if you read Sorachi's Animal Mind and Morals. I get the idea from him that it depends on your background, your view of the universe, your view of nature. And so if you have a Stoic view or if you have an Epicurean view, it changes what your view of mind is. And so the way you talk, it's all out of context.
It's all out of context, you say?
It's all out of
Yes. Again, I'll try to repeat this, although you're saying, look, if you come at the world with a certain worldview or philosophy, if you will, this stuff looks different, you'll describe it differently, you'll come to different conclusions. So I'm talking as though my particular take on this is independent of my particular prejudices and philosophical background. Something like that. Like Dan Dennett, if you heard this story from Dan Dennett, who's a philosopher who has somewhat different persuasions about these matters than I do, then you'd get a different story. So why believe my story? Is that a reasonable? You're looking puzzled like, that's not at all what I asked.
I mean, now we have ultra-Darwinism, and they used to have Stoicism and Epicureanism when they had
Yeah.
So they had different conclusions, or you had Cartesianism, and you had different conclusions about what the mind.
Yes, but we had Aristotelian science, and then we had, we had science of the Middle Ages, and you say, but we had, now we got modern science, so who's to say who's right? Well, modern science is to say who's right. Now, maybe modern science isn't right, but that doesn't mean that Aristotelian science is equally valid just because they believed it 2,000 years ago. We've learned a lot more. And it's more reasonable to suppose that what scientists today tell us is true than what Aristotelians told us 2,000 years ago is true.
But this isn't you versus Aristotle, it's you versus Dennett.
Yeah.
You within the
Same thing. No, let me. The fact that people disagree, it's certainly. You listen to two philosophers, and you probably get two different stories. What you have to listen to is the reasons for the stories, and ask yourself which is the most reasonable view. I don't think the fact that you get different stories suggests there isn't truth in any of the stories. It doesn't suggest that none of the stories are reasonable. It just suggests that there are many stories, and that's all. But there are always many points of view, and one makes up one's mind in terms of the reasons that support those points of view. If you feel that the reasons I gave weren't adequate to support the conclusions I reached, then maybe Dan Dennett.
Question right here.
Let me see if I understood you correctly. I was very confident when I came in here that animals have minds, and the thrust of your talk was that I should perhaps be less confident because some of the reasons I had seemed fallacious. Now, I should try to think about having the right history. If an animal has the right, being has the right history, maybe being, having an evolutionary history, being born of parents, the way we are, maybe that should count for more than some of those other things,
Yeah.
including behavior. Now that puts an awful lot of burden on the term right. What if somebody clones an animal? What if we find out later producing a cell that can then divide and turn into an animal? Is that the right history, or what counts as the right history?
All right, good question. I'll try to repeat it. The suggestion was that I was suggesting that this analogical reasoning, as it's typically and has been conducted, is seriously challenged these days, and to kind of get it back to some kind of reasonable form, we have to pay more attention to reasoning from the analogies with history. And the question is, what kind of history then is to be appropriate? If we clone an animal in the lab, or if we create one in some artificial way, is that the wrong history? If the animal ends up behaving and appearing just like a frisky dog, are we to conclude that it doesn't have a mind because it's got the wrong history? I was, in fact, suggesting something close to that, and that was my example of the scarlet galea. If you synthesize this plant in your basement and plant it in your garden, it might behave the same way, it might appear the same, but it won't behave that way for the same reasons. In fact, it won't have any reasons for behaving that way. And if you artificially make something in your basement, whether it happens to be you try to make a real $20 bill, see, that's not something you can make in your basement. You can make a lot of things in your basement, but you can't make a real $20 bill down there. You can't make a real Picasso. It takes Picasso to make a real Picasso. And it takes an authorized agency of the government to make a real $20 bill. And who does it take to make a real thinking animal? The suggestion is you can't do that in your basement either.
Question there?
I find it interesting that you phrase you talk about the degree of similarity as, and more similarity increasing the probability that other animals think or feel just like us. Instead, I find it interesting that you phrase it that way instead of questioning it to what degree do they think or feel just like us. So the degree to which they're similar to us increases the degree to which they think like us rather than increases the probability that they think just like us.
Yeah.
And I find it interesting that you get the first half and not the second.
Nice point. The question is, look, I've talked as though we're trying to make an inference to a conclusion. Well, are they thinking and experiencing like us, and that's more or less probable? Why not phrase it like this? We're trying to make an inference to the degree in which they are like us. So perhaps less analogous, less like us in their mental life, or more like us, and we have whole degrees here. Is that a reasonable? That, I think, is... I try to suggest that in ways by saying maybe animals without language couldn't have thoughts of the sort we had. Language may be essential for having certain aspects of our mental life, but the lack of language didn't inhibit animals, didn't prevent them from feeling certain feelings, thirst, hunger, pain, lonesomeness, perhaps, something like that. And I think your way of expressing it is probably a good way, saying we're talking about shadings of mentality here from a very primitive sort to a very sophisticated sort, and perhaps we should adjust our probability estimates in terms of how primitive the kind of mentality we're making inferences to. And that's certainly a relevant factor. Yeah, I would agree with that.
Question over here?
A lot of thinking seems to be about modeling the world, creating models of the world, and then predicting what the real world will do based on that, and then maybe acting on that to survive better. Can't we kind of just do a bunch of experiments and determine what kinds of models these animals must be making, must be capable of making and not capable of making? And we'll sort of find that they can make some of the kinds that we can, but not quite as good, not as sophisticated. Their time sense is not as good. Their self-awareness sense in these models is not as good, but it's sort of there, or it's not, depending on the experiment, and kind of just come up with fairly detailed comparison in thinking capabilities of animals.
Yeah, we can. We can say, all right, given their capacities, they can actually, do a great many things that require enormous coordination, advanced planning. You can imagine a kind of pride of lions going after, cooperating and bringing down a gazelle or something, in which there's kind of cooperative activity. But the question is not whether something's going on in them that gives them this capacity. There has to be, because they have the capacity, and we suppose that there's something in them that gives them the capacity. What we're worried about is whether this is conscious, whether there's anything going on in them like what we know goes on in us when we plan our day's activities. Because I sit down at my table, I make a few notes, I look at the calendar, I think about, well, look, I have to be in class at such and such a time. Now, is that kind of stuff going on in the animal, or is it just making models of, as it were, is its nervous system making models, and everything's dark in there? That's what I think people are worried about when they worry about animal minds. Not do animals have the wherewithal to do the things they do, obviously they do, but are the resources they call upon to do it the kind of resources that we think we're bringing to bear on our planning? And
I think we have time for one more question. Right there.
I was just interested in how, in your third point, you pointed out how recent experiments have proved to undermine this idea that animals have the same behavior as we do. And you're making an analogy similar to Darwinian revolutions undermining this idea of creative design. And you commented on these two experiments, one with the chimpanzee with Abe Helen. And I was just curious where you think conscious experience comes from, if it has to be from a visual experience or are there other places that you can achieve that?
well, I'm assuming that we all start from the same place. We say, look, we have a variety of conscious experiences. Right now, you're having an experience of me. You see me. There's something going on in your head which makes you aware of me, conscious of me. You can extinguish that experience by just closing your eyes and it's gone, open them, it's back. You also hear me. You're having auditory experience of me. You maybe feel things with your hands or in the back of your seat as you sit. You may be hungry. You may be bored. You're thinking about what you're going to do after this. All those things are conscious activities going on in you. And the number and variety of conscious activities and processes going on in people is probably limitless, because if you add the kinds of emotions and feelings and so, and it's those kinds of things that we all know from our first-hand experience that go on in us, that we wonder how much of that and to what degree that goes on in animals that won't and can't tell us, as animals can't. We can try to devise experiments which will, in quote, tell us, by making them behave in ways in which we can infer analogically, oh, they must have been thinking this in order to do that. But that is, I think, jeopardized by the realization that animals can do that without thinking that, without conscious experience. They don't have to see this stuff to move it, to catch it. And we know now that they don't have to see it to do what we need to catch it, i.e. see it. And once you realize that seeing it isn't necessary for catching it, then you wonder what's happened to the argument that animals must see things, otherwise how could they catch things? Well, we know now they don't have to see them to catch things. And that seems to me a kind of a distressing result if you want analogical reasoning to reach the conclusion that these animals most probably do have conscious experiences. We've got to find some other way of reaching that conclusion.